Hello everyone, today we talk about early medieval Jewish occupations. I already made a video about this timeline that we can extend, say, from the 6th to the 11th century AD. We made other videos about medieval Jews more in general, something also about the modern age, for example, anti-Jewish persecutions after the siege of Vienna of 1683. There is a lot to talk about in Jewish history that we haven't yet made on Schwerpunkt, and that actually deserves careful attention. I will not digress or start ranting like in the other videos, because these are, at least for someone, sensitive topics. I'm not talking about the Jews specifically, but those people that subscribe to my channel, because they think that if I talk about the migration era or Indo-European religion or whatever, I'm doing some kind of anti-Semitic content on the subject, which I will not express myself, because I've always been very clear against any form, in fact, of anti-Jewish discrimination specifically. And you can find actually much more eloquent and also colorful language like that I used to counter, in fact, the issue in other videos. So I decided also to keep kind of a lower profile in terms of what I could let out as a storm of emotions. In any case, that can serve hopefully at least as a straw man. Then if people want to go on with the video, of course, we will build more on it along the way. And I think the aspect is interesting, because I'm not an expert in Jewish history, nor I've actually read too much, right, aside from some books, of course, that I always pick mostly for the historical interest of it. Again, I'm not specifically an expert in Jewish not properly on Judaism, but also in general in Jewish history, and also for the Middle Ages. There is too few, in my opinion. Considering the relevance that the Jews did have, as we'll see now how, right? Not much just in the Middle Ages, but in fact for what has been built as a mythology of them, and I'm talking both of, and prevalently of, anti-Jewish ideologism, but there is also a pro-Jewish one that is definitely a minority, but that is also not the right way to tell Jewish history. In any case, this has nothing, to do with the general sympathy that I actually had. Or essentially, most Jewish people have met. It may be the actual, favorite community, like in terms of personal quality around me in my lifetime experience. But this, in fact, shouldn't affect me either. There is, however, and it's unavoidable to start like this, in fact, a mythology to address, right? That has also dominated a bit. This is not just conspiracy theory, but at some point it made it through historiography, because, of course, at some point there was a sharp anti-kind of Jewish feeling also among the ruling kind of scholarship, and that I'm actually quite sympathetic to the revival of many pre-World War II theories, knowledge, etc. But it is true that it was an excess before, right? Legitimately today we can't complain about the excess from the other side, right? Essentially a leftistic monopolization that I think is actually, I can't say fortunately is disappearing as such, but at least in the environment where I studied has been died out together with probably from a generational point of view, because fortunately at least the people who were indoctrinated in Marxism back in the day were in this sense so detrimental to any cultural level that even their pupils, of course, do not understand even Marxism on their own, so they have a vague kind of liberal or even leftistic but not particularly aggressive mentality, just mostly empty. And this is valid absolutely also for the wide majority of any conservative or right winger, and so on. But at some point, of course, the matter of also the idea of the Jewish conspiracy and so on was influencing the way we looked at, in this case, Jewish livelihoods in the we're talking about the early Middle Ages, roughly. So not quite strictly, we're right up to the high ones, right? But from late antiquity, let's say, to the first crusade. And this mythology revolved around a concept that is easy to use at some point, for some specific realities, right? Where you cannot deny the importance of the Jewry. We still have to make videos specifically in detail, but the concept is that the Jews as such, right? So not just some of them, and for reasons that were fundamentally discriminatory, and still, in fact, controlled by power that very often did defend the Jews against the level of violence and persecution that mostly, in fact, the lesser people carried out, and for reasons that were quite venial, telling the truth, not really spiritual, anti-Jewish specifically from a religious, from a different religious background. And so it's the idea that the Jews were overall privileged, right? That there was some kind of scheme of machination that had brought the Jews to somehow be above the others. Right? And we're talking about Christians here. We'll talk about the Muslims as well, but we're looking chiefly at the Christian world. And just for the record, like if you are an anti-Jewish, if you're a race supremacist or whatever, you're automatic. If you think that the Jews are above you, you're automatically saying that you're a lesser person, right? Because in traditional hierarchy, there is no such thing like the better people being under, and the worst being at the top, right? So it's just like a contradiction in itself, and the entire delusion of this whole. The fact, and as we just said, also that the protection of the Jews from the institutions was somehow, in fact, an end to itself, right? And or again some other strange favoritism that was meeting with an unfair policy, right? The fact that also their Talmudic law would keep, in fact, the entire Jewish community in a sort of kind of hardcore, closed and unmitigable, in fact, reality that would somehow want even to be discriminated, to be separated, marginated from the others. And so, not just for the Talmudic law per se, but also the community organization, family ties, so the inbred inclination and or the diaspora experience. And also that because of this, the Jews would have become just the stereotypical long-distance traders connecting Europe with the Middle East, with Islamic Spain, and that these were essentially the middlemen that profited mostly from a sort of culture war, and that were exploiting the thing mainly for example, slave trade and so on. And don't get me wrong, there were Jews that profited from this, as there were Christians, there were Muslims, right? And everybody did it, right? Christians often, enslaved other Christians and sold them to the Muslims. And if you consider the political strains that existed among, the same goes for the Muslims as well. And the Jews, as we'll see now, at some point had struggles within their community. So everybody would actually live of that business if it was possible and or tolerated and or viable for a reason or another. And as we'll see here, there is no evidence that this was mainly a Jewish thing, right? Compared to the bigger picture, even just not in absolute terms, but in relative ones. And there is also this idea that it wasn't just the Jews that we can frame stereotypically in that way, but also that they would be accompanied by other Easterners of some sort, right? consider that, of course, during the Roman Empire, the Jews had spread far and wide, right? Not just as a consequence of the destruction of the temple and so on, but just because that empire allowed, especially the most, in fact, sometimes the best equipped, but not only, communities to find, true meritocracy and more a space in this system. And so that eventually, even through the Carolingian era, etc., this community would remain on its own. Just it wouldn't be particularly blended with the rest. Admittedly, we do have documentation problems. So one of the first reasons why we can't even say these things is that we don't know them. And so if somebody say theorize them, should also be under the burden of proof that we can even methodologically and comparatively trace such a picture, right? And there were other scholars, even more presumably ideologically oriented, that went as far, in fact, as saying that the Jews possessed a veritable monopoly over commerce, particularly in the slave trade, right? And so from this to saying, you see, it was like that also at the time, and just like it is today, where notoriously we know that the world is ruled by the Jews, because, if you don't, you're just, a naive person that hasn't read, that doesn't know. And this is always the rhetorical. And I did find it's an interesting. I unfortunately do know, as I was saying at the beginning, that there are lots of. What is fascinating about them, because of course any conspiracy theory is first of all an expression of fear. This doesn't mean that the conspiracy may not be true accidentally, but mostly because with that kind of attitude, you can immediately understand that. People who come up with these ideas want to say you not say. They don't want to let you know too loud because we're all controlled and who knows what may happen, right? So at that point you really realize that there is something seriously wrong, just per se. Today I will completely stay out of any consideration why this happens. Of course, how the Jewish question was framed and why, and it would be interesting. I could actually make a video about that, because they always tell you, like, until, I don't know, my 30s, I didn't know what the truth really was. this kind of things, and they presume that you don't know, right? So they live in a situation which they like to alienate themselves into pretending that you are as ignorant as they are, right? To make up this stuff, right? So, and when it emerges that you actually know some things or two about the topic, they either stop babbling that stuff, or that they unsubscribe or something. Not largely, because I must say that on Schwerpunkt, as you know, I use actually very strong language. I'm very aggressive sounding, also violent mouthed, and I do use a very strong language and go really hard on certain issues that are probably not even pleasant to hear. All right, and I could again go as hard as that, but sometimes addressing things more, subtly is important as well. Now, the reason why this kind of this alleged Jewish centrality in those aforementioned activities, especially for early medieval Europe, has to be discarded, right? In fact, all this historiographical interpretation stems from the 19th and 20th century, that are also unsurprisingly the ones of the most anti-traditional ones, right? So I would pose myself some questions, right? It's not that before the Judenhass that didn't exist. It always existed, right? Especially there is this kind of weird, this is a leftist thing, that when they want to pretend that there was once upon a time, like, I don't know, the Roman Empire is a place where people were not discriminated against, where there was tolerance, or look at, I don't know, Muslim or Norman Sicily or this kind of thing. Look at all the races and religions, living together in a tolerant environment. excuse me, but I do meet people who believe these things, and the interesting aspect of that is not much that they, of course, don't know anything about those cultures, but that they want to force, like, just it can be from the right, the opposite of this, to the left. In fact, as we just illustrated, and really not talking to one another, so properly skipping evidence, because that would make automatically crumble any of these claims. And there is no, like, the half ground is rather a third way, right? You don't you can bail out of both positions without being effective any of the two, right? And instead, the thing that very often screws up everything is that when you try to balance, it's not that you're trying to balance these views and so trying to be a bit more left, a bit more right. It's literally that you're discarding both as trash, right? Because that's what they are, right? And both, as I was saying before, the anti or pro, there shouldn't be anything of this in the first place. The reason why those notions have to be discarded, not this thing about tolerance, but again, the Jews and the monopolists of trade, particularly the slave ones, and so mostly, given that we're talking also the golden age of Islam, right? So when the Muslims had the upper hand in the trade balance, right, would naturally bring those who were controlling markets mostly to have a control on slavery. So the fact that the Jews, for example, were historically more located in the Mediterranean as opposed to Central or Northern Europe, of course, makes us, given that great part of the Mediterranean was Islamic, says, look, the Jews were from that side, so they were actually trading Christians. Well, let's leave aside the fact that they would trade also Muslims and or other people that nobody actually cared about, right? The Christians that were, say, the Venetians enslaved the Slavs on the Dalmatian coast, and they were both Christians, even though by very different degree. But say the Venetians would sell them to the Egyptians, and as you know, great part of the resources of those same republics were invested in the same crusade. So there is no real circuit in this regard. We've seen how also in the Reconquista, the Mudayyars, they're not just the Muslims, but also the Jews, as a matter of fact, were, for example, just numerically an enormous community. Like in the area of the Kingdom of Valencia, after the Christian Reconquista, were like 40%, right? Something like that. So these were all people that eventually cooperated with the Christian rulers until basically were gradually oppressed and eventually even expelled, as you know, at the end of the Middle Ages, or forced to conversion and so on. So you can't definitely reason in a linear or dichotomic way. Just basing yourself on religion is seriously wrong. Also, because as I explained ad nauseam, there was a general understanding that actually the religion was the same, right? That there was essentially, there could be deviances. That of course the Jews were to go to hell in the Christian vision. They actually were tolerated, or at least they could lawfully stay in the Christian world as, and populate and as subjects and so on, because they were chosen as the witnesses of the end of times in the second coming of Christ, just because of course they were the closest in the Abrahamic family to the Christians. And so this was just to say, haha, I told you that we were right and then go to hell now. And that was the actual thing, but it wasn't just because of that. But even, just it was necessary to think this. Like in Dante's time, one of the single most cultured people in the globe at that time, he considered Muhammad as a schismatic Christian bishop, because there can't be in a universal religion an exception that is, there's something beyond that, right? Either you are in or out, right? This did fuel discrimination, again, but as we will see better also when talking about things like the Rhineland massacres, the episodic, in fact, Jewish killings and all the the mythology behind that, it was obvious given the kind of what the preconditions of those times and places really were, right? And as I said before, there are lots of views held both like that by both polemics and apologetics, right? And so even in the case of a pro kind of Jewish bias, you often see that there is mostly like an answer to the anti-Jewish bias. Then okay, let's study that from the sources as if all what happened recently enough had not existed, which naturally is very hard to do, as you understand. But again, that's always the preferential path. The reason why those notions are wrong is that there was no such a system. Like in the early medieval times, there couldn't be, just by political or institutional or social development, anything like a monopoly on commerce, and particularly slave trade. Jews were, of course, discriminated against to the point that they could handle money, as that was essentially forbidden in other religions, for which they could sin in that direction, making extra profit, and thus just eventually what, in fact, this was allowed because politics needed somebody who could do that. And what is the most convenient thing but entrusting this to a community that as all, not necessarily outsiders, but let's say a minority that depends mostly on the effect of the existence of a public order, etc., is loyal to that order, right? So also the thing of, again, the fact that they were privileged and next to the elites and so on, it's always kind of a populistic mythology for which the people do not understand that if they're ruled by someone, it's because there is something wrong with them personally, not if they could do better, if they could live without an order, like the world would either be in fact better. At that point they would become elite because there wouldn't be, it wouldn't be for everyone, or it would collapse because of course it would be an anarchic mess, and so nothing traditional and divine and hierarchically meant. That's also the reason why the Jews were actually and heavily and notoriously protected by the papacy, by the bishops, in times of persecutions, because these were institutions de facto provided with a temporal authority, wouldn't allow anything like disorders, clashes, etc. They knew how to put in line those who, at the end of the day, just wanted to attack this community by hoping to, for example, to rob them, etc. As far as they were just, however, that specific officials, right? And many, actually most Jews weren't, as today it's the case, they weren't anything like that either. So if we look at the beginning of our period, so let's say between the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century, Pope Gregory I, in his famous letters, affords say a reasonably comprehensive gaze over parts of the Mediterranean Sea. He was, as you know, one of the single most cultured persons in his time. He accomplished great things, including the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, and let's say connecting properly a continental Europe with a Mediterranean dimension. And Rome naturally was very projected towards the latter, was still theoretically within the Byzantine Empire. But as we've seen also in videos about Gregory, and or at least his times, there was a dramatic cultural, spiritual, and civilizational accomplishment behind the Roman papacy that was fundamentally also emancipating from Constantinople in a consistent fashion and virtue, also his spiritual primacy that Constantinople could never quite match. This was still in many ways it was a moment of crisis, moment of that we perceive at least today as a sort of transition from ancient to medieval times. But Rome definitely was one of the best places in Europe where late antiquity was actually being preserved, right? He came, as you know, from one of the single most distinguished senatorial families of Rome. And in this sense, he would make use systematically as a method of late antique epigraphy, especially from the same city of Rome that provided with an abundant amount of that, right? Have you ever thought what could Rome be in the late 6th or the early 7th century? Aside from those videos, I will show you now how, there were forests within the city. Yeah, but do you, aside from that kind of doomsday kind of obsession for how it looked like, do you know how it actually worked? Which I think is a much more interesting and important thing, because it seems to me the interest gets down just to, oh wow, here there were 1 million inhabitants and then it shrank, and look at how, that's the thing, right? Not the role again that the papacy had at the time or polities had. No, that's not interesting. That's not important. Refining your political culture is not important. It's nothing, of course, and the consequence of decades of educational collapse, of course. So there is a pattern of varied occupations that in this description by Gregory I, the Jews appear to have. Right? For example, they're mentioned substantial number as coloni on papal estates in Sicily, interestingly enough. So literally colonists, like peasantry that worked on somebody else's land, right? And especially in Sicily, where there were historically very large estates, like a very kind of Hellenistic land that the Romans had somehow, well, at this point, it had been integrated in what kind of the broader Italy was, also administratively, but it had always remained kind of a bit of a thing on its own. It was, in its own way, a gate towards the east, right? Important, the best position in the central Mediterranean. So the Jews had, just as a crossroad with other people, also established themselves there. Consider that, of course, most Jews in the Roman Empire came from an Hellenistic background, so even just they were Hellenized themselves, they spoke Greek. So a land like Sicily that we have seen, I made a video about Byzantine Sicily, just exactly about this phase, so you can check that out, would make a good place to live. Also because southern Italy at this time was still actually more advanced, surely more urbanized, more fertile, more kind of also trade connected with the rest of the Mediterranean than the north. In fact, we will make other videos to see properly where the Jews were concentrated, were important communities in Naples. So you understand all these kind of historically, actually Greek centers, because the southern Italian coastline had been colonized, the cities, and properly a urban environment. It's interesting, of course, at this point that the Jewry was distributed also among the peasantry, colonists, so pretty humble and kind of average reality, especially in the Byzantine world, like this one. There are some Jews mentioned by Gregory I as possessors of estates themselves, worked by Christian colonists and what are called in the source originari in Etruria, so in Tuscany, today's Tuscany. This is interesting. The distinction between coloni and originari actually has to do with, I think, the fact that coloni were just people who had somehow been brought there, or they had moved, whereas the originari were a bit more like the natives that had historically lived there, even if there was a difference between the two things. Also, consider this was after the Gothic War, so a moment of great distress. There had been population movements. It was a pretty hard moment, right? It's interesting to see Jewish possessors of estates worked by Christian colonists, and this was de facto, as we'll see now, better in another video, there were Jews owning Christian slaves, which was particularly painful for the church at the time, that always complained with the papacy for kind of changing the thing, and it was a complicated thing to do because the Jews had legally done this since what it was possible like at the time. In the idea of being particularly wealthy and owning a latifundium with colonists on it, like if you were rich, it was it, right? If some of these rich people were Jews, well, they had here. There are no differences with also the Christian landowners, so the question in numbers, statistical or whatever. So the question is, why would have, if not for the fact that they were of a different religion, not actually done that, right? The concern, of course, was spiritual. There was a deep traditional reason behind that, because, of course, the Jews were considered as literally infidels, right? So at least in a different way, they were more integrated. They had, of course, part of the scriptures in common with the Christians and all, but the idea that the subordination to someone that was fundamentally impure according to Christian standards was feared to cause significant problems to the salvation of the same colonists. This is particularly fascinating because it tells you how deeply at the time the fact of being under someone did equate to kind of a more transcendental traditional order of things. Like this hierarchy was essentially permeating as a kind of a spirit on its own. Eventually, all that were part of it. So it was seen again as for the chances of salvation from a Christian point of view, a big problem. And any landowner at the time, like in terms especially of these great latifundia owners, were, of course, was pretty, like, peasantry were just serfs, as a matter of fact. So it was properly a control, especially in the Byzantine world, right? That now much of that estate system had collapsed after the Gothic War. But still, there were few guarantees for the average person legally, just in terms of life quality and so on. So that's also the reason why so many had become colonists historically, from free people, in theory. Then Gregory describes some Jews as, actually one Jew, as buyer of precious metal and plate. This is a trader. Another Jew is a ship owner, heavily indebted, and for this reason deprived of his vessel in Palermo, in Sicily. So this is also interesting because it shows that the Jews, of course, invested, they were part of the market, they were in the game, right? So, like others, if they got indebted, were just confiscated their goods by public authority. There could be more said about this, but say not for today's video. There are Jews moving between Marseille and Rome via sea, of course, on their business, and probably they were merchants. This is not explicitated. This shows an important dynamic at the time, that is that central Italy was deeply connected with Provence in this case, right? So the southern Gaul that was heavily Romanized, and by the way, already part of a different world from Italy as far as the rulers were concerned, because that was part of a Germanic kingdom as opposed to the Byzantine world. So Marseille, naturally, like these, as we were saying before, these Byzantine maritime cities was still thinking to be a Roman city. They minted coins with, say, the same ones they used in the iconography and all in the Byzantine Empire, in Constantinople with the emperor, etc. So those were heavily Romanized worlds and had always had a deep connection, especially with Rome. and even Etruria, as we mentioned before. So this traffic did exist, and people freely moved, and that was it. The interland, however, where presumably all these goods were, in fact, also where these Jewish merchants were involved, had to do with the continental goal. There are Jews settled in Naples that we mentioned before as purveyor of slaves from Gaul for officials in their town. This is also interesting because it confirms what we were just saying, that is to say, not only the Jews were involved in trade from, say, with the interland, so we're not just part of a Byzantine reality. Of course, as middlemen, they could preferably be settled in advantageous markets like Marseille and so on. But there were slaves from Gaul that were that were sold under Christian rule, right? To be employed in, to be marketed in Naples for Byzantine officials. Now, the source doesn't say what slaves were these, right? But at the time, you have the Burgundians, the Franks that are ruling there, and that have also fundamentally, the Franks have hegemonized most of the region. They have crushed the Alemanni that are still basically pagan at that time. There was surely a florid market of slaves in the Rhineland, still in an area it was frontier, so the Franks would carry out their raids against non-Christian populations and sell them. But of course there were plenty of slaves also in the same Gaul, right? So obviously the Christian institutions there didn't have any problem having Jewish merchants that would sell slaves, because everybody sold slaves. And still, whoever did it increased through the tolls, through the income of the local administration. And eventually, the Byzantine officials in Naples also paid an important amount of money for having these slaves shipped from the north, and everything was working right through, as we've seen, connections with Rome, with Naples. So Rome and Naples are two different things as far as we've seen the degree of autonomy of the papacy and the kind of the Byzantine, at least attempts of centralizations are concerned. Also, Naples was relatively autonomous. But you see, this is the same. Just think about the episode, the anecdote of Gregory I looking at Anglo-Saxon slaves in Rome and saying, these are not angels, they're angels, right? Because they looked good, and they were transmitting that kind of openness to the evangelic message. We know how much the Merovingians facilitated the missions in Britain from Rome. So it was all part of an axis that fundamentally would agglutinate and Christianize and consolidate in terms of power, stability, of general international cooperation, Western Europe as we know it. And yes, slaves were out there. I made videos about slavery in Middle Ages. Mostly we observed at some point the transformation from colonists to free Massari of some kind, especially in Southern Europe, in the Longobard Kingdom, also after the Carolingian conquest, the Ottonian one. So there is, as you know, during the Middle Ages, a tendency to pass from, say, slavery to serfdom in a general sense, and depending on which land you look at, you have also probably a greater amount of free people. Right? In Central Europe, this thing would take longer, but let's say, in fact, but by the 6th century, it's obvious that slavery was everywhere. Right? It was completely normal, and it would remain for an importantly long time. In the entire Viking era, it was fundamentally based on slave trade and beyond. So I hope to cover these topics better, and here we find just together with other, because Gregory describes other slave kind of trade, etc. And the Jews are just incidentally in, together with Christians. We have in other sources than Gregory, at this time, the knowledge of Jewish owners sailing their ship along the Provençal coast, that, as we've seen, was very active since even pre-Roman times in the Western Mediterranean. At Naples, Jews take upon themselves to provide the besieged city with food during the Gothic War. This is powerful because essentially you realize that these were perfectly integrated Jews that had wealth, and when the city is besieged, they basically spend their resources to supply it, which is quite interesting. Some Jewish merchants appear, of course, in the Byzantine world in the 6th and the 7th century. Now, as we will see, there is a reason why, multiple reasons why the Jewish presence in the Byzantine Empire was scantier. Now, first of all, in Constantinople, we find a Jewish glass worker, which is admittedly suspect in this because his trade conveniently supplied the stage and means for a miracle. That is, the furnace in which his boy converted to Christianity miraculously survives, right? It is, of course, kind of an anti-Jewish story. Of course, sometimes we will see now, we don't understand whether certain Jewish figure appears in the Chronicles or in other, like more like anecdotal examples, because the literature is not always very clear. It's not like a true chronicle saying, okay, it happened, that thing, we're talking about it. No, there are some stories in between and so on. You don't understand whether these are real people. It's just, I don't know, some folk story. It's still meaningful that the Jews, however, are portrayed in them and in different ways. At Tura, in northern Gaul, actually, well, it would be central Gaul, a Jew arrives because he has to realize a debt owed him in lieu of public taxes. And promptly he is murdered by a converted Jew, interestingly enough. We find some merchants that in the Latin source says in species in this sense. It could be spices, right, from the presumably from the east. The source says magna species, by the way, so important spices, presumably from far away, arriving, in fact, in Clermont, also in Gaul. And there is one Jew at King Chilperic's court, even, that, quote, served the king, I mean, as a buyer of spices, right? So the Merovingians relied on these Jewish merchants for luxury products, right? So for their court, presumably, as you know, for preserving food and storing other, right, and having also this kind of supplies possibilities. And this shows, still at this point, it is allegedly the darkest era or something, such long-range trade. We find the aforementioned problem for an episode about a Jewish physician at Bourges, who is introduced to highlight a healing miracle, and we don't understand whether this Jewish doctor was a literary invention or a real character. And the broader pattern we get from this early centuries is that the few Jews that appear in the Merovingian realm were likely visitors from the Mediterranean, broadly speaking. There had been historically Jewish communities in Gaul, but say with a broader decline of urbanization, all these things, generally speaking, we have not much evidence of them. We know they were there. We know they were probably even traveling far, even in the north and so on. But hey, we're talking about the 6th, the 7th century. Here we are lucky if we can hardly have any evidence, and we know that millions of people inhabited there. So of course there were people from presumably very varied background, especially as far as they were invested in long-range trade, like in these examples we saw. Then later data naturally augment the range of Mediterranean livelihoods. Especially as far as the Carolingian Empire was concerned. The 8th century was a moment of economic revival, generally speaking. We find, for example, in northern Italy, a Jew formerly associated with the court of Charlemagne himself, being held as an expert in precious metalwork, right? So a goldsmith of sort, and even here with higher connections. And we know in mainland Italy that there were further practitioners of this craft, and considerably more merchants and craftsmen of other type, as you understand, right? So for the luxury production, there was also a much larger kind of or basic production. So the Jews are accounted in that. So artisans, merchants. In Constantinople, Islamic Spain, and Sicily, we find more Jewish merchants. Right? In Constantinople, we know there was an important community of Islamic merchants as well. And interestingly enough, Jews are also present as craftsmen, entrepreneurs in textiles, tanning, and also taking into account some slightly later evidence, silk working. So also in this case, especially as far as textiles and silk work is concerned, long-range travelers, right, of essentially luxury products, also from faraway lands, as you understand, mostly the Islamic world, considering the direction of the silk trade. Naturally, Constantinople had a great international trade pool. We find for the 11th century Cairo Geniza the evidence of intensive trade by Jews in the broader Islamic Mediterranean. So Egypt, North Africa, Islamic Spain, Islamic Sicily, in which, however, the Jews of Christian Europe did not take part. This aspect also makes you reflect, because we did observe how, even cartographically, like in terms of the wide amount of knowledge that the Islamic world accumulated at this point and studied by degree, there was a sort of kind of more shelled self perception of the Muslim world, of the Dar al-Islam, right? To the point that even, say, northern Italy was considered like a very far away place, even though it was very close, easily reachable, and there was plenty of Christian merchants, as we've seen, that actually entered the Islamic space. But interestingly enough, when we look at the Jews that traded extensively, at this point we're talking about, again, the peak years of Islamic trade in the Mediterranean, which was deeply intertwined throughout this axis from Spain to Tunisia, Sicily, and Egypt, and Syria, only Jews that were based in an Islamic territory. So the ones coming from the Christian world did not interact, were not part of the club, let's say, were probably even ousted by a degree. This is particularly interesting. I couldn't tell you why, aside from this perhaps kind of broader monopoly attempt. It could be extended on the base of not the Jewish, but in this case the broader Islamic world was concerned. And the reason being perhaps that, in fact, Islamic states at this point were more centralized than the Latin Germanic institutions. And even though, in fact, the latter couldn't quite control what was moving, and they were actually even encouraging that by a degree, the Muslim powers wanted to maintain a control on the trade balance, right? Not to, say, export too much precious metals, right? And in this sense, avoiding also some business with the North. That could be more mediated through, for example, high-level exchange, like we know of, say, the Carolingians sending to Baghdad horses and swords, because that's fundamentally what they were about. And of course, the Muslims sending high games of technology like water clocks and precious textiles and so on. But in this sense, not really perhaps opening to kind of lesser trade level of interaction. Naturally, was surely plenty of Jews from the Christian world that did actually trade in the Islamic world, as were many Christians that did the same. So this may just be an optical distortion, and it just speaks of just the dominance of the Islamic markets to a point that they would retain an important control. Because you see, the Jews in this sense were more apostolates. They could move probably more easily than what the Christians could do, presumably. Especially in the moments of greater, say, clash, militarily speaking. Consider that, of course, this is blurred by the fact that even when we talk about the Saracens, we are actually looking at Muslims, but also Christians, notoriously. I mean, what we call the Saracens in the Western and Eastern Mediterranean were very often Spanish, Italians, Greeks as well. And they were Christians, yes, and nobody cared, essentially, even under presuming that those ships were under an Islamic power. However, the Saracen phenomenon is very much more connected with piracy than actual, say, big-scale expeditions. I mean, the major land powers were mostly continentally oriented. Think about Spain, right? Also, say, Fatimid Egypt could reach even as far as Libya and beyond. But they were faraway places. They were more concentrated with the relation with the Levant as a territorial state than what this other kind of pirates could do, right? In very and also often scarcely documented realities. We don't know, for example, so much about, say, Islamic Sicily, right? It was a much more kind of let's say the fragmented world and compared to the greater accomplishments of Islamic civilization somewhere else. However, that was also a great trade center. And so it's likely that some Jewish communities that had traditionally inhabited southern Italy, as we have seen before, there were lots of Jewish colonists in Sicily at the time of Gregory I, were still there, and they did still essentially work and also trade and etc. Interestingly enough, in this Islamic Mediterranean, there is a frequency in Jewish doctors. This role of the physician sometimes is metaphorical, but others are historical figures, for sure, For example, Shabbatai Donnolo from 10th century Oria in Apulia, that was actually one of the earliest medieval medical writers and a distinguished philosopher, very, very famous figure. You realize that he essentially lived in a Christian reality, the border with essentially with Saracen invasions, etc., but still fundamentally being from the other side. There was Asdai ibn Shaprut in Spain. Here we're talking instead probably in a fully Islamic context. We may, I think, that also some of the Jews we can find on the island of Chios in Greece in the 11th century were emigrate of some sort from Christian Sicily, right? After the Islamic conquest, perhaps they left to other Christian and specifically Byzantine territory. However, it's worth noticing that these Jews of Chios are Serbs, right? While they may have been so more from a legal than necessarily kind of an economic point of view, that is to say, maybe they were Serbs as colonists as they had been before, they may have also ended up there as slaves. Perhaps, like who knows how, right? Perhaps through simply legal means, right? Maybe they had been enslaved for some reason in Christian Spain and then sold in Chios, and or maybe this had happened under the Muslims, or this was a consequence of some kind of kidnapping, deportation, maybe occurred during the Islamic period. I don't know whether this is from already the, say, Norman Sicilian times, but everything may be. Like, Sicily was very, in terms of different communities, very, very composite, although the backbone was Latin Christian at the end of the day. And we often don't know too much about most communities at the time. Really, there's very few. If you want to study Islamic Sicily, first of all, you should know Arabic, which is pretty complicated. But as we've explained many times, Islamic historiography is substantially different from Christian one. It's much kind of foggier in a way. It's much more kind of conceptualized, but mostly through some canons that do not criticize more than much. I mean, by the 11th century, if you look at Latin Germanic historiography, it's really advanced. I mean, it's really much more kind of insightful, simply more survives. I mean, not because of destruction, but literally because of production, right? So we always tend to underestimate the West, even in times of evident development. We do know, of course, from charters dating from 9th to 11th century Italy, Christian Spain, right? Because from Islamic side, in fact, we don't know much, and South and East Central France, so all Christian lands, that the Jews owned agricultural land as well at this time. There's no doubt. So there hadn't evidently been any major significant change in the juridical mechanisms and or largely the Jewish I mean, some Jewish communities were very old, right? Jews in Rome, for example, date back from, I think, the 3rd or the 3rd century BC. But as we were saying before, just because we know that, maybe it's even earlier. So these charters in Latin, in a Christian context, show us that it was normal, even in lands that actually had, think about Spain, especially, that had been under important Islamic pressure, and so many points of view. I mean, at some point, the Moors had claimed overlordship over the peninsula, right? So we've seen it often, like many Muslims, just alongside the Christians. The famous route of Roncesvalles was carried out by Basques, mostly, yes, Christians, and barely Christians, by a certain degree, in pagan terms, but also Muslims as well next to them. So we're looking at worlds also that had, by a degree, been, if not completely Islamic, but that at some point had some kind of Islamic presence next to the Jewish one. This is mostly for the Spanish reality. I don't know whether, for example, these Italian charters are from some place in the south that had been previously occupied by the Saracens, but mostly, aside from Sicily, that was properly ruled by the Muslims as a whole, also the southern or central Italian avamposts of the Saracens were just kind of like fortified rings. They were not demic colonies, right? They were mostly pirate nests. So presumably, even if they could control some area of the interland, there wasn't any significant change or even mingling with the local communities, so including the Jews that lived within them. And as we've seen in southern Italy, that historically were consistent Jewish communities, some of the most developed, some of the most affluent, as we've seen before for Naples and so on. The same goes for south and east central France, because some of these areas, as you know, had been ravaged significantly by the Muslims, even well after 732. Poitiers, that stopped prevented the Muslims from securing Aquitaine, but didn't end Islamic incursions in the south for centuries. And naturally, for us to have these charters that show the Jewish agricultural land ownership, well, there were many more. Mm-hmm. They're not a particularly high rate compared to, of course, mostly a sea of Christian owners. But it's important to point out that there were. How was this ownership obtained, handled, whatever? Well, transmission and mortgage of landed property is a very frequent object of litigation from these charters. Like when you wonder what is like an average charter talking about in this high medieval context, well, it's obviously about land ownership. I mean, that was the single most important thing ever. So everybody could be, even large territories. There are disputes between bishops and monasteries, I mean, kind of like that. So they were always complaining, whose land is that? What's the traditional revenue, especially when it passed from an owner to another, or if it was occupied by somebody unlawfully, how much money was given to, and how would the local, of course, authorities respond to that? It's mostly about this, right? Land was transmitted and mortgaged, where none other, and there were concerns. And also, naturally, the fact that, and I haven't studied these charters, but presumably the fact that that these were Jewish owners could perhaps put a stigma on them of some sort, right? That would make it easier, say, to occupy the land owned by a Jew than, say, the one of a bishop or a public official. I mean, it was a big deal because naturally the Jews couldn't hold higher offices in this world. These aspects dominate the formula books for Hebrew deeds that we can find also from Islamic Spain and southern France. There were non-Jews working these Jewish-held lands. We're talking, interestingly, about a recurrent frequency of vineyards, and rather than simpler fields. So this indicates that the Jewish proprietors were perhaps often in partnership with some sharecroppers of some sort. I mean, they specialize. They invested in a more specialized business, perhaps. This goes in parallel with the frequency of their merchant activity. The fact, as we've seen, that they could, by a degree, also hold money, and they would be connected with some Christian power sometimes. Without considering, of course, all the Jews that worked for Christian owners in other lands. As we were hinting at before, when we look at the Byzantine Empire and all this, we realize there isn't much evidence of Jewish landholding. And when one realizes what's comparatively the scale of documentation between the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe, one realizes it's totally normal. I mean, the Byzantine Empire produced much less, documentarily speaking, than the West by the 11th century. It was a much more crystallized society. Large estates were still a thing, right? And actually had increased, as we've seen recently also in that video from about the Komnenoi. This was an old issue of the Roman state to try to keep the estates, the late antique latifundia, intact by a degree. These had shrank by, especially the let's say after the distractions of the Gallic Wars. This is particularly evident in Italy, where things in fact were not that different in terms of land ownership than in the Lombard part on the long run. Whereas in Constantinople, this had given rise to still, yes, a maintenance of some sort of local autonomy, but also quickly of protection systems that had favored the increase of enormous latifundia at the end of the day. And it's obvious that these landowners wouldn't be part of a minority, that because they were involved in state offices and all stuff. So it would have been much more difficult, just statistically, for a Jew to be one. Plus, there is a much scarcer evidence. Surely there were Jewish landowners there, of different scale, say, of wealth. Thus, it was much more difficult for the Jews to make it in the Byzantine Empire in general, right? And considering like how speedily the West was increasing in power at this point comparatively, there is an interesting connection could make, at least for the general conditions that existed in Latin Germanic Europe. This thing is highlighted by the fact that, for example, such remotely controlled areas like southern Italy display ownership of agricultural lands by the Jews, meaning that the West as a whole, and also in areas that had been controlled by the Byzantines but that were fundamentally being lost by this point, in fact from Constantinople, had a much better history of Jewish integration in many ways. I mean, the Byzantine government in early medieval times was really despotic and also kind of erratic as far as, a religious policy in a Christian Orthodox sense was. I mean, as you know, Constantinople winked at heresies, at heterodoxy. They carried out the iconoclasm, so they were not new, of course, with a specific Caesar-papistic policy to this kind of oppressive measures towards whichever community they wanted to target, right? And I'm sure there is a history of Jewish emigration from the Byzantine Empire in the West as a consequence as well. Also during the iconoclasm, I mean, there were Syrians, actually mostly the elite, right, at that point, who could make it, that transferred themselves in Byzantine southern Italy, that, as we've seen, was more open and somehow freer, right, just politically, economically, than Constantinople. And yeah, we could. It goes in parallel with what we were saying before regarding the scarcity, say, of also documentation, for example, for certain areas of the Islamic world, but how probably the less statalized realities had a much less mediated kind of trade connection with Christian lands. This is particularly important. We actually have sparse references of Jewish landholding also in northern France and Germany. Right, they surely cannot compare to the extent of the findings from the Mediterranean, but they still are present. There is also here a historiographical matter, because in this northern space, the Latin writers were mostly clergymen, right? It was much less, say, documentary practice or literacy and documentary production than in, say, Italy, for example. And as a consequence, also the vision of these authors of society, not just of the Jews per se, is different. It's also sparser. Jews are perceived in France and in Germany mostly as, if not only, as merchants and physicians, interestingly enough. This could have to do with the greater vertical development of the Merovingian monarchy. We're talking about proper monarchies here that are developing as such. So probably if they had a direct connection with the Jewry, this tended to be as kind of hierarchical, right? With the best Jews, the richest, the most entrepreneuring, as we've seen before, most merchants of spices, of, say, so entrepreneurs that had a considerable amount of money on their own and could cooperate, as we'll see now, with the Frankish world and the Frankish monarchy, government broadly meant. In fact, probably this Latin historiography is not even wrong in considering the Jews mostly as that, at least not literally, as there were many more Jews that were not that, but these were definitely the most significant Jews, and also in a political and social perspective. In the Hebrew record from the second half of the 10th century onwards, so also with the stabilization of the Ottonian Empire and also the Capetian monarchy, commerce is the patent mainstay of livelihood in central and northern France, as well as in western Germany. These areas were developing economically, and importantly enough. There's a succinct statement by Gershom ben Yehuda, the Light of Exile, of the exile of Mainz, that had an important Jewish community, and representing essentially the most important Ashkenazic religious authority of that time. He lived around, say, 960 and 1028. His death is known. And this statement is the Jewish livelihood depends on their commerce / merchandise. This is very interesting. And again, it's normal because you have here monarchies that fundamentally tend to rule from important centers, mostly of Roman foundation. You see here from, it's essentially northern France and the Rhineland, right? So Mainz being, of course, the old Mogontiacum, and if, of course, such monarchies attracted higher, so richer, as we've seen, merchants mostly, as this Jewish source properly also highlights, it's because, of course, these were the communities that would most likely be attracted from those same governments, from also faraway places. Again, this was essentially Ottonian Germany, right? Think about the connection with Italy, the reopening also to that Mediterranean world after, in fact, decades of interregnum. So it's obvious that the Jew at that point would arrive installing himself, presumably with an important retinue, with his goods, also with all our logistical system, connections, etc., in trade centers. So not kind of mass migration of peasantry from somewhere else, because the Jewish population was just per se quite scattered on its own, but these kind of more prominent figure. We can find this also in the, actually from an eastern direction, from literally the steppes. Think about the Khazars that were at some point converted, at least in part, to Judaism, and that posed huge problems also still today in Orthodox Judaism, because of the matter of the blood connection with the ancient tribes of Israel and so on, which they weren't, right? Because they were converts, and eventually they were the Khazars were destroyed by the Rus, and so they are presumably also the most entrepreneuring elite. So also likely the one that had converted, because most of the Khazars were pagan at the same time. So converting to, as they did, to Judaism, to Islam, to Christianity, was a way just to connect the elites to the most powerful empires, the Caliphate, Constantinople. And as you know, after the collapse of the Khazar Khaganate, many of the Khazars, and so many Jews in this case, went living in mostly Central Europe, right? Probably also in the Rus, even though it's not so well documented like Central Europe. But as we've seen in the development of urban centers in areas that had not known urbanization historically, like Poland, Bohemia, in parts also of Germany, given the princely political, institutional, state building that was essentially starting from a center, from a city. Think about Prague or Krakow, etc. The Jewish merchants were quite important to make a lot of things work, and plus they were, as a minority, dependent on the princes, the kings, and thus they were automatically loyal to that institution because they wouldn't have any other support locally, especially considering that this state building was opposed by the local ethnic aristocracy that in fact in those countries developed a fierce, also in Germany, but I mean France even didn't kid either, historical anti-Semitism, because of course over time it doesn't start, say the mechanism of course starts with the creation of the local Jewish communities, but of course the reasons why this took the path that we know better in, say, contemporary times is something that had to do with the development throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the modern age, mostly the failure of essentially of centralized state building, and so actually a even fiercer opposition from a more powerful oligarchy against any monarchic attempt, and so the king's Jews, right, and the urban cities, the urban centers that had been founded by the kings to stem the aristocratic pressure that was mostly land-based in the countryside. And so that is one factor as well. We do see Jews definitely traveling, importantly, also from faraway places, notoriously sources from Spain, from other important... I mean, in Spain there were really lots of Jews before the end of the Middle Ages, and there were, again, here merchants that were also from the Islamic world, and so they famously toured countries like Hungary. I talked about this in that video about 12th century Hungary, Poland, possibly also Russia, given mostly the itineraries that we can follow or retrace and so on. And we don't see in this mechanism, interestingly enough, any major kind of treasury created from this Jewish trade. This were just merchants like others, and just most of the capitals were reinvested locally wherever they were, and again in countries where the Jews didn't have aside from this part of princely support, much of a broader branching, right, in politics and society. Interestingly enough, in this major trade, in areas like Central and Eastern Europe, where slavery was still consistently there, we don't see anything about a Jewish slave trade. The Jewish traded goods are pretty, regular, like a bulk of staple goods, and then more costly merchandise, which was bought, transported, and sold. We see salt, wine, dyes, medicine, salted fish, cattle, hides, pelts, ready-made garments, textiles, also silk, as we have observed, gilded and copper vessels, some precious metals, right? So this naturally is evidence from just a wide range of sources that deal with different places that had different resources and kind of, in fact, also different trading partners, right? And in general, however, given that, as we've seen, there was, especially as the expansion of the Mediterranean trade also towards Central Europe, like the longer, the more costly, like mostly the customers of this Jewish exports were bishops and priests. In one case, we have the treasurer of a bishop, affluent dames, including a queen of Hungary, who is also the only royalty mentioned in the sources as far as his more direct personal purchase was concerned. But we find magnates, counts, right? So it's actually the aristocracy, and this is also an interesting datum per se. There is a debate among the same Jews regarding the moral implications of, for example, money borrowing. They are the same ones that the Christians had among themselves, any relation with the Jews, and vice versa. For example, Jews were debating at the time whether Jews borrowing money from other Jews was a deplorable fact or not. Right? If you did that with Christians or Muslims, it was kind of okay. But as far as the direct interest-bearing loan was concerned, there were worries that we can track, especially in Central Europe, as we've seen, there was essentially more profit in relative terms, considering again the lesser amount of Jewish population compared to Mediterranean Europe, where, as we've seen, mortgaging and landed property was how Jews mostly lived. Think about this, how eventually, say, certain areas of southern and western Europe developed their kind of Western attitude towards the Jews as opposed to Central and Eastern Europe. Because these differences are very relevant. They're not the only ones, right? But you can immediately understand from a cultural point of view how different ideas came about. Historically, for example, in the Netherlands and in Italy, Jews were discriminated against, but they were integrated in society. They had an open thing. In Central and Eastern Europe, it was a total and unmitigated disaster based on mostly, in fact, kind of a constant discrimination also from countries that were less developed in general, right? And that made it even more difficult for the Jews, as you know, to educate themselves, and they were kept in conditions that were absolutely miserable, right? Nothing to compare with essentially the middle class of, again, the Dutch or the Italian Jewish communities, right? So as the Christians were concerned for all this money that was flowing in their hands from the general revival of the economy during the 11th century, so were the Jews, right? And especially about this internal composition within the community, which is interesting because, of course, the Jewish minorities were in fact under somebody else's control, right? Namely the Christian ones, but they also had to organize themselves. And we do get evidence of ferocious rivalry within the Jewish community over such economical opportunities that would give rise to violence, murder, right, among each other, within each other. So a sort of mob war, right, which would bring Christian authorities, just as to protect, say, the Jews when this was done by, say, by Christians who wanted to rob the Jews and creating unrest and all this stuff. And so also repressing the same Jewish clashes violently. I'm not even saying, of course, that the Christian authorities always protected the Jews from lynching or things like that, especially after, in the wave of persecutions started with the First Crusade. But tendentially that was the case, and especially from the church, right? Because, controlling the mobs was always an enormous issue for all powers of this time. So, yes, clashes were not good, but if this allowed, to settle the matter and to make it more stable, sometimes the authorities could turn a blind eye as well. The Jewish communities, thus, given their minority condition, developed legislation that was, today we can't enter in the juridical details of the spread, the homogenization, but fundamentally was based on two ordinances, principles, and laws. One was the ha-yshuv, which essentially gave the community as a whole the right to veto the settlement of newcomers, which seemingly was a problem, and probably and especially in Central Europe. The Khazars, all the things we said before, because those would always be seen as outcomers, right? And also the Judenhass of Central and Eastern Europe very often came upon all the other factors that combined from the fact that sometimes these were, say, in Germany or in Poland, people coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, let's say. So they were foreigners, and generally speaking, people don't like outsiders, right? So this added to the pile of problems that had accumulated in those countries, including also the enlargement of the community. And so the problem that also from a minority perspective, thinking about the Middle Ages, probably this time was not so pressing, but it was also a matter of, again, you have another rich guy that enters the game in the market. It's a competitor, right? So it's an issue. The other law is the Marufiyya, which actually stems, as you understand, from an Arabic term, which in fact comes from the more Sephardite background, for which the Jewish community assigned a potential customer to a single merchant, right? So there was a shared consensus on who had to deal with who, which is actually very thoughtful to avoid kind of shady things and to remain compact, also in front of the authorities and so on. Naturally, we see monetary exchanges increasing in the Jewish community, just as for the rest at this time. And this sparked mostly the aforementioned regulation by religious authority, of course, of the matter of taking the interests between the Jews and so on. There was, of course, also a loaning of outsiders, right? Meaning the Jews could give funds with or without interest to others, other Jews and other people outside their community, which could be, in this sense, as we've seen, also other Jews outside their own community, which would constitute an important issue. And this depended essentially on whatever the economic circumstances that the represents. And there is an evidence, the fact that the greater issue here was the debt arising from the provision of goods, right? And this we have seen also in some videos about medieval England, like, for example, the policy of Henry III over Jewish loans, like to the barons, for example, that played an important game in the relation with the crown. So these Jewish communities were, as we've seen in that case, also kind of bullied and exploited and kind of manipulated in ways that could serve the political interests of the ruling establishment. There is a clear preponderance of trade as livelihood. There were lovely craftsmen, as well as Jews and Jewesses, by the way, in among the serfs, even among the slaves. Interestingly enough, so this shows you how shaded, kind of properly, the idea of slavery was becoming. And it's interesting, as we were saying before, that the Jews didn't seem to engage in slave trade at this point, and this may have been actually a consequence of the broader changes that were occurring in the Mediterranean. Like, slave trade was much more of a thing in, say, northeastern Europe than in Mediterranean, where people were becoming fundamentally. There was, depending on the societies, of course, not all pan-Mediterraneanism does not exist, but as far as Christian Europe was concerned, like, for example, countries like Italy didn't witness much of slavery at this point. There was probably another type of wealth distribution. In the north, you still had the Crusades to happen. You have, this other non-Christian peoples to be crushed, all this stuff. And generally speaking, people were somebody else's privately in Central, Eastern, Northern Europe. It had become de facto the reality. And so the fact that the Jews wouldn't engage in slave trade there seems quite fascinating, because it's as if they had just been in the norm of the kind of the Mediterranean provenances, and would presumably engage in slave trade, and especially in Spain still there was some kind of that with the Reconquista and all, but they were probably also part of a much more kind of refined type of economic mechanism that was not just about slavery per se, and or was probably out of their control. Like, as we were saying before, the Venetians that enslaved the Slavic pirates of the Adriatic, and they sell it to the Muslims in Egypt. Well, the Jews didn't have an institution that could do that. They didn't have a state. They didn't have a city, a republic, or anything. So they were just, as we've seen, kept also aside within that as a discriminated minority. And we will discuss also the Jewish possession of slaves, which was present in the early Middle Ages, together with a bunch of other things regarding. So they're set, and we'll have to cover an important degree of information. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.